Henry IV of Castile grew up surrounded by expectations. The court saw him as the continuation of the Trastamara line, a young monarch destined to secure the future of the kingdom. Yet behind the ceremonies and the weight of inheritance stood a fear that he carried in silence. It was not the fear of war or of God. It was the fear of himself. From adolescence he believed that within his own body lived a force that weakened him, a presence that stole the strength expected of a man. The earliest accounts from his physicians mention long periods of fasting and restless sleep. He avoided touch, avoided warmth, and spoke of purity as though it could protect him from something unseen. He refused to share baths with servants, refused to be dressed by hand, and ordered that his linen be changed every morning. He said it was not for comfort, but for control. Those closest to him noticed that he treated his lower body as if it were a separate, dangerous thing. He called it the source of temptation, the place where strength was lost. When he reached 20, the court arranged his marriage to Blanca of Navarre. The alliance promised peace between kingdoms and the possibility of an heir that would secure the dynasty. The wedding was celebrated with splendor, yet by morning the celebration had turned to silence. The servants who waited outside the royal chamber for the ceremonial proof of consummation received nothing. The sheets were clean, the attendants dismissed, and the king said nothing. The same silence repeated in the following months. Each attempt ended before it began. In private, he told his confessor that at night he felt himself drained of energy, as if something living fed upon him while he slept. He called it a demon, a punishment sent to remind him of impurity. Every morning he ordered that his sheets be examined, searching for evidence of what he described as the theft of strength. The inspections became ritual. No one dared to question them. He began to rebuild his sleeping quarters according to a new set of rules. The mattress was replaced with slabs of marble wrapped in linen. The temperature of the chamber was kept low even in winter. Servants were forbidden to light fires or approach the bed without gloves. The king explained that cold subdued the body, that warmth invited sin. He slept sitting upright, avoiding any posture that might allow the body to move freely. Physicians who observed him noted the constant tremor of his hands, but when they offered remedies, he refused. He said he had chosen discipline over weakness. For the council, the matter soon became political. 2 years after the wedding, no heir had been conceived, and the alliance with Navarre began to fracture. Blanca's family demanded an annulment, declaring publicly that their daughter remained untouched. The scandal humiliated Castile. The king, once a symbol of continuity, had become a symbol of failure. Letters from foreign courts began to refer to him as El Impotent. Within Castile the word was never spoken aloud, but everyone understood. Henry withdrew further into ritual. He surrounded himself with confessors who told him that abstinence was a divine gift, not a defect. The fear that had once consumed him turned into doctrine. He began to preach restraint and self-denial as virtues of a higher order. His palace grew colder, his routines more rigid. Servants recorded that every movement of his day was measured, every gesture deliberate, as though he were trying to erase all signs of human need. By his 30s the rumors had hardened into fact. Physicians no longer spoke of treatment. The council stopped discussing the prospect of heirs. The royal chambers remained silent, the bed untouched, and the inspections continued. What began as private dread had become the defining ritual of his reign, a king who lived in fear of the proof that he was still a man. Years passed, and the silence around the king turned into routine. The bed remained cold, the chambers dark, the marble slabs unchanged. The council spoke less about heirs, but the question hung over every meeting. Without a successor, the throne stood on air. In the end they turned again to marriage, not for love or hope, but for survival. Joanna of Portugal arrived at court young, confident, and full of ambition. She had heard the rumors and refused to believe them. She spoke of patience, of faith, of her duty to give Castile an heir. Henry accepted her with courtesy and distance. He promised respect, not closeness. The wedding was celebrated with splendor, but the first nights brought the same silence that had destroyed his first marriage. The queen tried kindness, then devotion, then prayer. Nothing changed. Months later, the palace awoke to impossible news. The queen was expecting a child. For a few days, hope returned. Bells rang, courtiers smiled, and priests declared that God had restored the king's strength. Henry said nothing. He appeared at no ceremony, attended no mass, and avoided every conversation about the birth. The servants whispered what the king already knew, that nothing in his life had changed, that the cold bed had never been touched. When the child was born, the court waited for the king's recognition. None came. Henry refused to appear, refused to sign the declaration, and sent word that no heir would be proclaimed without his command. 2 days later, he ordered the queen confined to her apartments. He told his confessor that he had never shared her bed, that her pregnancy was proof of betrayal. He said the humiliation was worse than weakness, because now the whole kingdom would know what he had always feared. The nobles were divided. Some demanded that he accept the child to save the crown. Others saw in the scandal a weapon to use against him. The queen denied the rumors, but every attempt to defend her made things worse. Her name became the center of whispers that filled the palace corridors. One name began to appear beside hers, Beltran de la Cueva, a young courtier once trusted by the king. Henry's decision was swift. The queen was removed from public life, and an inquiry began, an attempt to prove that he was incapable of fatherhood, and therefore innocent of deceit. The council of bishops, physicians, and nobles gathered in silence. They questioned attendants from both households, asked for details of the king's habits, and examined the rules of his nightly discipline. Every answer pointed to the same conclusion: the marriage had never been fulfilled. The king's condition could no longer be denied, but neither could it be condemned. The priests called it divine protection, a sign that he had been chosen to rule through purity. The physicians called it fear turned into paralysis. The nobles called it the end of the dynasty. The commission wrote nothing, published nothing, and left behind only silence. When it was over, Henry withdrew even further. The queen's child was never acknowledged, her name erased from official prayers. The marble bed remained untouched. The air of the royal chamber stayed cold, the same as it had always been. But now the fear that once lived only in whispers had become law, a private obsession that ruled the kingdom more firmly than any decree. The scandal surrounding the queen never disappeared. Even after she was confined, her child remained the question no one could silence. The king refused to acknowledge the girl, saying that a man who had never shared a bed could not be a father. He spoke of betrayal as a disease that had entered the crown through deceit. The council begged him to accept the child for the sake of the kingdom, but he would not bend. The queen was eventually sent away under the pretext of poor health. Her household was dismantled, her letters intercepted. Beltran de la Cueva was quietly removed from court and given a distant post. The child was placed under royal guardianship and raised in the palace as Juana, the king's daughter in name but not in presence. Henry rarely mentioned her. He did not attend her baptism and refused to hear reports of her health. Outside the palace, the story took on a life of its own. People said that the girl had her mother's eyes and the temperament of another man. They called her La Beltranilla, the daughter of Beltran, and the name spread faster than any decree could suppress it. In markets and taverns, the kingdom laughed at the notion of a virgin king who fathered a child through prayer. Within the palace, the servants whispered that the silence around the princess was thicker than the stone walls themselves. Henry's response was not anger but retreat. He filled his time with confessions and prayer, surrounding himself with priests who told him that the child's existence was another trial sent from God. They said that through patience he would overcome humiliation as Christ had overcome pain. He listened, repeating their words like scripture. At night the same rituals continued, the cold chambers, the inspection of linen, the marble slabs that replaced warmth with numbness. He told his confessor that the demon had returned, that it now spoke to him through the mouths of his enemies. By the late 1460s, the rumors about Juana's birth had turned into open rebellion. The nobles who opposed the king declared that Castile could not be ruled by a man whose own child was born of adultery. They called his reign cursed and began to speak of replacing him with his half-brother Alfonso. Henry tried to answer with words of faith. He said that his purity was his strength, that those who mocked him mocked the hand of God. But his speeches no longer inspired loyalty. The court had grown tired of sermons that could not defend the throne. Juana remained the center of every argument. To some she was innocent, to others a symbol of corruption. The queen's defenders insisted that her conception had been miraculous, that God had restored the king's potency for a single night. The clergy divided, each side choosing which miracle to believe. Meanwhile, the king sat in silence, watching his kingdom fracture around a child he could not call his own. The rebellion that followed was not loud at first. It began with letters, then with gatherings, and finally with armies. Alfonso's supporters marched under banners that showed a broken crown and the words for truth and blood. The king stayed in his capital, pale and unmoved. He prayed, he fasted, and he waited. To his followers he was a man purified by suffering. To his enemies he was already a ghost. In the years that followed, Juana grew up surrounded by guards and silence. She rarely saw her father. The courtiers bowed to her but never spoke her name without hesitation. Her existence was both proof and accusation, a living reminder of the fear that had consumed the king. For Castile, she was the heir of uncertainty, the child of a monarch who had built an empire of marble and silence, and left behind a question that no one could answer. The years that followed Juana's birth tore the kingdom apart. What had once been a whisper of doubt became the daily language of politics. Nobles no longer hid their contempt. They spoke of a king who ruled through prayer instead of will, a monarch who had turned the royal bed into a tomb of lineage. Each side claimed to defend Castile's honor, but every word was really about the same question: who had fathered the child? Henry lived as if the conflict existed somewhere far beyond his walls. He continued his habits, the same cold chambers, the same sleepless nights. Every decision passed through confessors before it reached the council. The priests around him insisted that he must not answer insult with blood. They said purity would outlast slander, that patience would silence rebellion. But the silence did not save him, it only deepened the sense that Castile was ruled by absence. By 1464, the nobles had chosen a new figure to rally around, Prince Alfonso, the king's younger half-brother. He was healthy, ambitious, and untainted by scandal. The opposition declared that the throne should belong to a man who could continue the bloodline. Armies gathered in the provinces, banners were raised, and the kingdom began to divide between two kings. The confrontation reached its climax in the summer of 1465. In the city of Avila, the rebels staged a ceremony that became legend. In the middle of the square they built a wooden platform and placed upon it an effigy of Henry dressed in royal robes, crowned, and seated on a throne. Before the crowd they read aloud the charges: that he had betrayed the faith, that he was ruled by women and priests, and that he was incapable of producing an heir. Then, one by one, they stripped the effigy of its crown, its scepter, and its sword, declaring him unfit to rule. When the mock king lay toppled in the dust, they raised Alfonso to the throne in his place. The act was both ritual and rebellion. Its meaning spread faster than any army could march. In towns and villages people began to repeat the story, and every retelling made the humiliation worse. Henry answered with letters of forgiveness, not threats. He called the rebellion a test of faith and said that truth would return like light after darkness. His words reached no one. Even his supporters began to speak softly, as if defending him too loudly might invite shame. The war that followed was slow and confused. Battles were fought, truces signed and broken, but the true struggle remained inside the royal household. Henry avoided strategy meetings, spending hours in prayer or silence. He trusted only his confessor and a few loyal advisors who assured him that endurance was victory. The marble bed remained untouched. The palace stayed unheated, its corridors dark even at midday. Servants said the air inside felt heavy, as if the king's fear had settled into the stones themselves. When Alfonso died suddenly 3 years later, the rebellion collapsed. Henry returned to the capital in a procession that felt more like a funeral than a triumph. The streets were lined with banners, but the cheers were forced. The kingdom was exhausted. The child he refused to claim was now the only link to continuity, yet her name still carried the stain of doubt. The court addressed her as princess, but every conversation ended with silence. The rebellion had not restored his authority, it had made his weakness permanent. He ruled a fractured land, trusted no one, and spoke little. Each year the palace grew colder, the prayers longer, the isolation deeper. His own body, once the secret of his torment, had become the metaphor for his reign, silent, sterile, and locked away from the world it was meant to sustain. By the final years of the decade, even the priests who had defended him began to lose conviction. They still called him chosen, but their voices lacked belief. Castile remained outwardly calm, yet every subject knew the truth. Their king had survived the war, but not the shame that caused it. The last years of Henry's life passed in stillness. The wars were over, the rebellion spent, but the silence that filled the palace was heavier than ever. The great halls stood empty, the fires left unlit, and the king's routine never changed. He woke before dawn, prayed alone, and spent hours writing short notes to his confessors that rarely contained more than a few words about faith, purity, and endurance. The council met without him. The affairs of state were handled by men who no longer expected his opinion. He lived almost entirely within his private chambers, surrounded by the same cold that had defined him since youth. Servants described how he asked for water to be sprinkled across the stone floor before sleep, to cool the air even further. The marble bed remained, polished but unused. He refused to be touched, even by his physicians. When illness came, he met it with the same discipline that had ruled his body all his life: fasting, silence, and prayer. The courtiers said the king was not dying, only withdrawing from the world one breath at a time. Juana, the daughter he had never claimed, was now nearly grown. The court addressed her formally as princess, but few believed she would ever rule. The nobles whispered about replacing her with Isabella, Henry's half-sister, whose marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon promised a new future for Castile. Henry did not protest. It was as if the question of inheritance no longer concerned him. The idea of lineage, of blood passed from man to child, had long since become something distant, something that belonged to other men. As his health declined, the priests around him spoke more boldly. They told him that his weakness was not failure but a form of divine favor, that God had spared him from the sin of desire and given him the strength to rise above the body entirely. Henry listened and believed. He began to call his condition a blessing, a sign that heaven had chosen him to reign through spirit, not flesh. The court, exhausted by years of contradiction, repeated his words out of habit. In the spring of 1474, his strength began to fade. He stopped attending Mass, too weak to stand, and ordered that his confessor read to him the passages about the trials of Job. When pain came, he welcomed it, saying it was proof that his soul still resisted temptation. The few who remained near him said that in his final days he spoke softly about light, about peace, and about marble, the cold surface that had guarded him from himself for a lifetime. He died without ceremony, in the same chamber where he had prayed, fasted, and slept in solitude. There were no heirs beside his bed, no family, only priests who whispered that the king had conquered the flesh through suffering. They buried him with the honors due to his rank, but even at the funeral the silence was noticeable. The courtiers bowed, the bells rang, and Castile prepared to move on. In the months that followed, Isabella claimed the throne, uniting the crowns of Castile and Aragon. The marble bed was removed from the palace and placed in storage. The servants said it felt colder than stone itself, as if it had absorbed all the fear and restraint of the man who had lain upon it. For most kings, history remembers victories, treaties, and heirs. For Henry, it remembered only the absence of them. His name became a phrase whispered with pity, a ruler who fought no wars, who left no son, and who spent his life defending himself from the body he was born to rule. In the end, Castile's greatest weakness was not his fear, nor his failure, but the silence he left behind, the silence of a king who believed that to deny the flesh was to serve God, and who discovered too late that a kingdom cannot live in the cold.